Finally, Tenakoto, 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 Katoa. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jonathan Mason, Chair of the New Zealand-US Council, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion about navigating geopolitical uncertainty. The discussion is on the record. Plan to make a video recording available on the Council website, so that means anyone speaking or asking a question will be visible on the screen. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Richard Fontaine. Richard talked to us back in July 2024 about Asia foreign policy and the sort of need for the U.S. to refocus on Asia. He's chief executive for the Center for New American Security. The center is an independent bipartisan think tank based in Washington, specializing in U.S. security policy and foreign policy. So quite relevant to the challenges that we're facing in the Iran war, or Iran special, let's call it excursion or something. Richard also serves concurrently as a member of Anthropic's Long-Term Benefit Trust, executive director of Trilateral Commission North America Group. And earlier in his career, Richard was foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain, worked at the State Department, National Security Council, and staff on the Senate Foreign Relations. So extensive background. It was interesting. I'll give just a little bit personal perspective. Marsh came out with the #1 risk issue back in November called Geopolitics. And there's boards that I've been at where I mentioned that, and I had other board members saying, I don't understand how geopolitics can affect our business. Can you explain that to me? And I think the Iran conflict has illustrated how quickly a geopolitical event, very far from New Zealand, actually also very far from the US, can affect everyone in their pocketbook almost immediately. So I think we have the answer to why that's a risk. But for New Zealanders, Richard, I'm just going to talk as a group. We hear conflicting things about what the war's objectives were and are, and we're now worried about two parts of the war. One is how the traditional conflict ends, but second, how is Iran going to voluntarily agree to opening up broadly the Straits of Hormuz, and under what conditions might they agree to that? And this then underlines how long is this conflict going to go on? And then secondarily, sort of, what does this mean for U.S. foreign policy in Asia and New Zealand and Australia's contribution to that? So what we just discussed, actually most of us heard it, is any remarks to sort of set the scene for, call it 10 minutes, would be welcome. And then we'll open it up for questions. And as you say, almost make the next 50 minutes, 55 minutes, a conversation where maybe you learn a little bit from us and we learn a lot from you. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you virtually. Look forward to being there in person later this year.
Yeah. Richard's coming for the summit in early December, or late November.
So it's great to be with all of you, and also to see some friends on the screen. And I hope I can learn. I could probably actually learn more from you than you learn from me, but I'll do my best on my end to sort of sing for the virtual supper. Maybe we could start by why did this war start in the first place? And I think, there's the stated reason. Well, I should say there are the stated reasons which has really confused a lot of people because these objectives keep kind of moving around all over the place. But the fundamental one that the White House said at the beginning, when all of this began, is that the United States had to deal with an imminent nuclear threat from Iran that was threatening to attack Americans. And I mean, that just can't be true. Um, it can't be true for two reasons. One, uh, Iran was not enriching nuclear material. It wasn't enriching uranium. It hasn't enriched uranium since most of its centrifuges, if not all, were destroyed in the last year. And they hit on the nuclear sites during the 12-day war. And it doesn't have a stock of weapons grade material. It has some 60% material, which you could sort of cobble together. And it also doesn't have any ability to reach the United States. There's no ICBM in Iran, and they weren't close to getting one. So there was not an imminent threat. There are threats from Iran, and there have been threats from Iran for a long time, and the proliferating number of their drones and missiles was certainly threatening to the region and to American forces in the region, and et cetera. But I think it was not about threat, it was about opportunity. I think there was a sense by both Israel and by the administration in Washington that the opportunity to kind of finish the job in Iran was open now in a way that it had not been before and may never be again. After the 12-day war, Iran had basically been rendered almost defenseless from air attack because of the destruction of its air defense systems and its missile defense systems. It was deeply penetrated by intelligence agents on the ground. Its nuclear sites, of course, had been mostly destroyed. It had lost its proxies in really, or at least had very weakened proxies in Hamas and Hezbollah, lost its proxy in Syria because Assad was gone. So, you know, the Houthis have still sort of stayed out of the war in Yemen. And so if you look at all the things that Iran could do in response to an attack, then they were considerably less, at least this was I think the thinking, they were considerably less than they used to be and considerably less than they would be in the future. So that in turn gave an opportunity. The other thing, frankly, I think on the American side, that, you know, they thought this would be easy. And you know, like I worked in the George W. Bush administration many moons ago. And I was at the State Department during after the invasion of Afghanistan and during the invasion of Iraq. And I remember a little bit of what military success does to decision makers because, you know, Afghanistan went really well at the beginning. And if it hadn't gone well, we probably wouldn't have done Iraq. And it's hard to remember now, but Baghdad fell in 3 weeks and it looked like Iraq had gone really well. Then what was the first thing the Bush administration started doing? Well, they started to threaten Syria. And there was some talk, well, you know, real men go to Tehran. Once the quagmire started, of course, nobody's talking about going to Syria or going to Iran or getting, you know, any of this stuff. But when you get into this mindset of like, hey, this is working, and, you know, this is solving some of the problems we've had. And so I think the idea that you know, the president in his first term had hit Qasem Soleimani, and there had been, you know, very little reaction from the Iranians to that, then took out the nuclear sites with very little, you know, damage on the back end of that, then captured Maduro in a very successful, you know, kind of operation. So, you know, this works. And this is also you know, dealing with problems that have bedeviled the United States for a very long time. And, you know, we got to have the guts to deal with it. Now, among the problems and among the differences between the current operation and all these other things is those were very discrete, specific military objectives. I mean, you can go blow up 2 nuclear sites, or you can capture one guy, or you can kill one guy with a drone strike. This was a very expansive and therefore very ambitious set of objectives, even in their sort of lower way of defining these. And so I think that sort of explains how we got into this in the first place. The objectives. So the president in his initial remarks came out and spoke expansively about regime change in Iran and about how this will give a once in a generation opportunity to Iranians to take over their government, take back their country, you know, all of this other stuff. The Israelis were explicitly talking about regime change. Of course, it's hard to understand the attack on the supreme leader and the political leadership of the government without thinking that regime change was at least on the table. The U.S. military has talked about this almost since the beginning very differently. They've said their military objective is to destroy or at least deeply degrade the Iranian Navy, the drone productions, and the missiles, both the stock, the launchers, and their ability to make them, the factories, the companies, all of this. And sometimes they'll throw in nuclear as well, but that's sort of a separate thing, and they've stopped talking about that. I mean, frankly, there's sort of two levels now at which this war is operating, both of which are extremely relevant. But there's the war inside Iran and this military objective of destroying maximum number of the Iranian Navy, the ability to produce drones, the drones themselves, the missiles, the missile launchers, the ability to produce missiles. That's actually going well. I mean, those are achievable military objectives. This is essentially an off-the-shelf war plan that's been refined for many, many years with, standard list of targets. CENTCOM is working through, the Central Command is working through their list of targets from top to bottom. It's been Israel, not the United States, that's gone after the political targets. And so, in 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks or something, I think it's very likely that CENTCOM will get to the bottom of its target list and say we've hit all or most of our targets. You can keep finding new targets. You can hit old stuff from before, but they'll have completed their target list. Now, if that had been the case, if we were talking about this a week ago, the situation for the president would have been, given that this whole thing has gotten more complicated than I thought it was going to be, do I let CENTCOM go all the way through and complete its target list for another few weeks, or do I declare victory and go home? That is no longer available to them because of the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, because there's no indication that the Iranians are going to open the Strait of Hormuz simply because the United States stops attacking Iran. They might, or it could be part of a deal, but the Iranians clearly don't want this kind of thing to happen again. And so one of the ways that they're trying to achieve that goal is to make this as absolutely as costly as possible for, a decent amount of time so that, the deterrent effect of this will be maximal. So you got this sort of inside Iran military operation, which is actually going very smoothly and well. And then you got this outside of Iran, which is going completely sideways with the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, the attack on something like 14 countries now that have been, attacked or intercepted things. I mean, all the way Cyprus and Turkey, and in addition to the Arab Gulf states and Israel and everything else. And then, of course, you got these, what at least until a few hours ago was shaping up as a global energy war in which we're all going to lose if that stays, in effect. I mean, there's no winner in that, and it looks like they've stepped back for the time being. And so that's what's happening. The number one priority now is to clear the Strait of Hormuz, but that's no easy task. I mean, when the Houthis were blocking the Red Sea shipping and attacking Red Sea shipping a few years ago, I mean, there was an international coalition to try to deal with that. Multiple countries bombed the hell out of the Houthis and everything else. And finally, it was really the last year when Trump cut a deal with the Houthis, say, don't shoot at us and we'll stop shooting at you. That sort of opened that up. In the Strait of Hormuz, the Brits are coming in and talking about putting together an international coalition and things like that. And there's certainly military things that one could do, and we could talk about what those things are if you guys are interested, in order to open the Strait of Hormuz. But they're hard, and they would probably take a while. A while meaning like more than 2 or 3 weeks. Probably longer than that. And so maybe at this point in the war, there's some sort of critical decision points that I think the U.S. side is facing. So, I mean, one, just as a matter of realization, if you know anything about U.S. foreign policy, you know that since the Jimmy Carter administration, the U.S. has had a policy of resisting any attempt to control the Persian Gulf, and now we see why. So even in an era when all our political leaders like to talk about, American energy independence and how much fracking and how much we're producing at home and how much we export and all this other stuff, and we don't even really need to care about the rest of the world. Well, of course we do, because we care about the global price of oil, not just the physical stocks. And so when President Trump comes out and says, well, we actually don't really have a dog in this fight when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz because we don't get our oil from the Strait of Hormuz. That is true and irrelevant, right? So what we care about is the price. And I can tell you, because I filled up my car just a couple of days ago, the price of a gallon of gasoline is like 50 cents higher than it was, a week ago or whatever. And people are feeling that, in a significant way. And so, if you have these big Middle East supply shocks, then you're going to have an effect on the price, no matter where your supplies actually come from. The other, so then now this puts like a kind of Trump in really, I think, a somewhat of a major dilemma. So he could try to end the war now, declare victory, go home, sort of thing. And if he does, not only might the Iranian regime continue to block the Strait of Hormuz, but CENTCOM hasn't completed its target list, and so you'd live with a hostile and wounded but not destroyed Iranian regime. And a number of countries, particularly in the region, even the ones who said this war is not a good idea, now say that because of that, this would be the worst possible thing to do, would be to end the fighting right now, because then you have this sort of radicalized, extremely hostile but still capable Iranian regime. The other thing you could keep doing is keep going. That's been so far the decision, until CENTCOM has destroyed all its military targets, works to open the strait. The president is trying to get some additional military optionality. There's a Marine Expeditionary Unit that's on its way, which will probably arrive in about a week and a half or two from the Indo-Pacific. So we can talk about the pivot in a minute. We're pivoting the other way. There's other stuff coming in from the Indo-Pacific, THAAD anti-missile batteries from South Korea, and things like that. So you could do that, but of course, then the question is, how long does that take, and what are the economic costs of continuing that? The economic costs, of course, to everybody who is, like you said, looking for diesel in rural Australia, but also the administration just said that they're going to submit a $200 billion supplemental budget request to pay for the war and to restock munitions. I mean, even these days when we borrow all the money, $200 billion is still a lot. So now there's a diplomatic effort. It started last Friday to try to build an international coalition to open the strait. You've seen expressions of support from a number of countries. But that's hard work, and how much they're going to be willing to put their own forces at risk in order to try to do that remains to be seen. It's I should say, I guess, maybe an awkward time to be asking our allies to be doing things like this. They have an interest in having the strait open for sure, but the administration has spent a lot of the last few months, sort of slamming a lot of our allies and describing them as free riders who get rich under American protection, or saying that we want Greenland and these other kinds of things. And of course, like in the Red Sea coalition, Denmark was a key player because it has some naval capabilities. I don't know that the Danes are going to rush to, sort of help out this time, and they might, because again, they have an interest. But this is a reason to keep those relationships healthy. We have Prime Minister Takaichi from Japan. My office is across the street from the White House. We're at 1701 Pennsylvania Avenue. So if you could look that way, and she's there right now at the White House meeting. I think it's telling, if you're thinking about grand prioritization of regions and issues, that the overarching worry of the Japanese team when they came here was that Trump was going to really give her a hard time about Tokyo declining to participate in the Strait of Hormuz operation. And surprisingly, they just met in the Oval Office, and round one, these leaders usually have to do kind of two rounds and try to run the gauntlet. And so round one was, he actually said, "Oh, Japan's great," and they really stepped up, and so he seems to be kind of keeping his ire for the Europeans. Although then he made a joke about Pearl Harbor, which was the first time that's ever happened by an American president in the presence of a Japanese prime minister. So a mixed group here. But if you step kind of back from what's going on now and talk to this issue that is been dear to my heart and probably dear to some of yours, which is, what really is the priority region for the United States and the world? What are the priority issues for the United States and the world? I mean, the greatest long-term challenge of the United States, I believe, remains China. The greatest priority region in the world remains the Indo-Pacific. One of the keys to dealing with the China challenge is to work more closely with our partners and allies across the board, including closer economic, trade, military relationships. I think statement of the obvious. That is not the policy of the United States at the moment. Since I've been doing this stuff now for a long time, and since George W. Bush, every American president has said that they're not going to squander American lives and treasure in the Middle East because we have other bigger priorities in other parts of the world, and that the other presidents who did that were foolish. And then every president has found themselves consumed by some huge issues or wars in the Middle East. And here we are again, and that's of course on top of Ukraine and Russia and all of those other kinds of things. I guess the last thing I would just say is, then, well, what does this mean for China? Which, I think probably when we talked last time, I mean, China was like so on the minds of everybody in Washington. And you wake up in the morning, you think about China all day long, you go to bed thinking about China, and everybody said, you Americans are obsessed with China and all this other stuff. And it's really changed in terms of administration policy. The Director of National Intelligence put out the annual threat report yesterday, and you can see that they've watered down a lot of the ways in which they talk about China. Our China policy today is really rooted around a desire for a trade deal with China and to have good leader-to-leader relations, including at the summit level, rather than this bigger, broader kind of competitive environment that we're going to be in. Uncertain exactly where this war in the Middle East goes. Certainly has not gone according to at least initial expectations. The objectives seem to be changing throughout the war, and this quite obviously is having ripple effects on everybody around the world, and also in America's policy toward other parts of the world, including the Indo-Pacific.
New Zealand is, for understandable reasons, high-income, small country, been really wedded to the post-war multilateral institution order. And specifically in actually peacekeeping negotiations and countries not invading other countries, that post-war order has been very successful. Are we moving away from that? Has the U.S. decided that the ability to act autonomously as a powerful nation means the UN and other multilateral institutions are increasingly irrelevant?
Yeah,
and this is occurring on trade, of course, and other places too.
I mean, the short answer is yes, the U.S. Is moving away from a full-throated embrace of the rules-based international order and the multilateral institutions that undergirded a lot of that. I would point out that that's not only the United States, and it's not only Trump in the United States. I mean, the Biden administration was out constantly saying the WTO was a big failure, and all the free trade agreements that the United States had cut over the years had impoverished, working Americans and were terrible. And we've learned all these lessons from how not to do things and stuff like that. And we need a new trade order. They never really specified what that new trade order is, but nevertheless, they expressed deep discontent with the rules-based trade order. The Trump administration has a beef, obviously, with the trade order. It has a beef with multilateral institutions in which it thinks either tie America down in a way that America could more exert its power if it was acting unilaterally, or that can constitute a bunch of free-riding allies that aren't engaged in sufficient burden sharing, and then America has to disproportionately bear a burden of whatever the activity is, NATO or anything else. Now, that it's strange because I travel a lot internationally, and especially if you're like in the global South, I will hear over and over again that the rules-based international order is sort of Western project that was engineered by the United States and a few other powers for their own enrichment and aggrandizement, and they've been uniquely the beneficiaries of it, and everybody else has kind of gotten screwed. And then Washington, everybody says, well, it's actually the world that's better off, but we're the ones who've gotten screwed. And then if you go to other countries, they say, well, we don't have sufficient representation in the way things are. So like almost nobody is actually content with the rules-based international order. I think New Zealand and Australia and some European countries are like, well, given the alternatives, it sounds pretty decent to us. But the big countries that are most disruptive in that, the United States, China, India, Brazil, Russia, all of them all have very different but very varying hard reasons why they think things are unsatisfactory. Um, I mean, look, I think some of this is just I think kind of short-sightedness. I mean, there's this notion in the United States that the rules-based international order trade and otherwise has impoverished the country, although, the share of global GDP accounted for by the United States is as high today as it was in 1976. And, 20 years ago, the EU economy and the American economy were about the same size. Now the EU plus UK, America is 150% of the EU plus UK economy. So yes, there's distributional effects, which people are very worried about, but it's also kept the great power peace for a longer period of time than in any, modern, all the reasons why these things aren't perfect, but they've tended to be better than what we saw in the first half of the 20th century for sure. And the hard part about this is no one's really got anything to replace these things. And so I think we're what we are on the front edge of this period that's probably going to go on for a good 10 years or something, where we're exiting, one order, but we haven't entered the new order. And the new order will have features of the old one that'll still remain in place, and there'll be other ones that are gone, but we don't know which is which. And so we're in this period that's going to be pretty disruptive and potentially dangerous now for quite a while.
Wonderful to hear these perspectives, Richard. Really appreciate it. Just so everyone's aware, I'm from Fontaine. I'm interested in just circling back to the Iran issue again, and I'm curious to know what your perspectives are on to what extent you see a negotiated outcome as being a necessary component to the conclusion of what we're currently seeing in the Middle East. And then further to that, what do you think the domestic triggers are for the US to want to sit down with Iran, particularly if you're looking at the kind of cost of living impacts on everyday Americans? How do you see that playing out in the US domestically?
A negotiated outcome with Iran is going to be exceptionally difficult. One, the negotiators are been killed, so most of them have been killed. I mean, there's a foreign minister still around, but like Ari Larijani, who was really had a lot of authority behind the scenes and engaged in a lot of nuclear negotiations. I mean, he's gone, and other folks. So again, yeah, you could try to do something with the foreign minister, who probably speaks for the government. But let's just say the patterns of cooperation are not exactly robust these days. The other thing that is harder is to figure out there's two things. One is, what is it that you're negotiating about? The only thing that I can kind of see, which would be less a negotiation than a diplomatic understanding, would be if we stop bombing and attacking your country, we and the Israelis, then you've got to open the Strait of Hormuz, and within a certain amount of time, short amount of time. And if you don't do that, then we start attacking your country again, and probably escalate the attacks. I mean, Trump keeps sort of talking about this, but there are things that would be particularly destructive that the United States and Israel could do that they have not yet done to Iran, which would be pretty terrible to do. But they're on the list of options. So that's that. Now, from the Iranian perspective, it's now been twice that the United States has been engaged in negotiations and scheduled a new session for negotiations and then attacked them in the middle of the negotiations. So they feel double-crossed not once, but twice. So they're, I think them, I don't know, for example, opening the Strait of Hormuz based on some sort of diplomatic understanding, the chances of that, I think, are probably zero. It would have to be based on some sort of demonstration of action on both sides. And then that's totally separate from what do you do on the nuclear side and all this other stuff, which I just don't see as in the cards anytime soon.
Thanks, Richard. I just had a question. I heard an interesting sort of theory the other day from someone that I didn't quite agree with, but had me thinking. That they were thinking that essentially what the United States is doing here is just trying to pick off some of the Russian and Chinese proxies one by one, with sort of Venezuela, then Iran, the threats against Cuba, to sort of start to weaken, I guess, some of those allies of Russia and China. I struggle to see sort of the grand strategy behind it, but just interested in your views on whether there is actually a grander strategy at play here.
No. Oh, sorry, I can elaborate, but I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, this is not about. I mean, and also, I mean, if you had to think about what's the best way to weaken China, would you attempt regime change in Iran? I mean, or if you had to, the best way of weakening China would be to go after Cuba, or even weakening Russia to go after Cuba while we're not providing gratis assistance to Ukraine. I mean, it just that doesn't add up at all. I mean, even if you take Cuba off the chessboard, just like Venezuela is off the chessboard, I mean, it's not a good day for China and Russia, but it doesn't materially weaken them in a very significant way, the way that, for example, more robustly aiding the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russians would, or other things that one could dream up. No, this is driven by, I think the Iran stuff is driven by what I said before. The Venezuela business was driven by its own set of circumstances. Cuba, I think, is driven by the longstanding desire to, see some sort of change in Cuba, but also, I think the president has this sense that there are festering problems that have been around for a very long time, but previous presidents haven't had the will or the guts to actually deal with them, and he does, and he's been successful in dealing with those challenges. And so, Cuba's the next kind of one, because the first president of the United States who said that the Cuban government is just about to fall was Dwight Eisenhower in 1959, and here they are.
It seems like Israel has been sort of delegated this task of taking down Iran's leaders, and it's hard to understand it other than this hope for regime change. And it's hard to see how there's going to be successful protests sort of taking the government back, although Trump and Israel continue to challenge directly the Iranian people there. What's your view? And you note the disadvantages of taking out negotiators, because how can you get a negotiated outcome? What's your view of that sub-strategy of trying to kill off the Iranian leadership? The pros and cons of that?
Well, I think I thought from the very beginning that the chance of having regime change in Iran through the use of air power alone was extremely low and probably very close to zero. And I think if anything, we've seen a consolidation around the regime so far. And of course, this is the same regime that just withstood by slaughtering who knows how many tens of thousands of people, a major uprising in January. And so I think the Israeli theory of the case really was, I think it's starting to change now, but I think it really was regime change. This is a tyrannical regime. It's sort of like, if North Korea was governing the people of South Korea, if you weaken the regime sufficiently, then people will take matters into their own hands, overthrow it, and govern the country. It would be great if that were true, but I don't think it's likely at all. Trump doesn't even talk about regime change anymore, but he did at the very beginning. So I think that he's been pretty, mugged by reality on that as well. The pros beyond the regime change is, Iran's ability to act militarily is less when the government is in absolute disarray because you keep killing the leaders or because they're in hiding and things like that. So it's, so that's a pro. Another pro could be, we don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of years. So let's say this war ends in 2 or 3 weeks or something, and who knows how it's going to end. I think the regime's going to be in place, But is this the kind of, lethal blow that doesn't materialize for another year or two? I mean, Milosevic was bombed from the air in a NATO campaign, and at the end of it, he was still in charge. But a year later, there was a popular uprising and he was out of power, right? Like, so it's conceivable. Is it likely? I don't know. And then the cons are, one, I mean, I think everyone seems confused about what exactly the objectives of this war are. And the other, of course, is that had the United States and Israel said, look, the real threat here is how many drones and missiles Iran is building and its aggressiveness in using those in the region over the past few years. We can't live we can't live with an Iran that has such a proliferation of drones and missiles that they can basically overwhelm any defenses in any country in the Middle East forever. So we want a narrower military operation to destroy their capability to develop drones and missiles. That would have been still fairly expansive, but it would have been a narrower military objective. When you say we want the destruction of the regime, then they're cornered. Every weapon they have is use or lose. They have no incentive other than to shoot at everywhere all the time, everything they've got, because they're, this is it. And so, that's the downside, I think.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Richard. It's really interesting to hear from you and your experience and views on the conflict. I work for Air New Zealand, so understandably we are following the fuel price very closely, and we are looking at potential scenarios. I'm not going to ask you how long you think that this will go for, or what you think the sort of duration will be, because I guess no one will know. But in terms of the Strait, and you've talked a little bit about the Strait already, but sort of from an outsider's perspective, what sort of things should we be looking at which might signal there is some progress towards reopening it? What are the things that, when we're scanning the news or we're receiving security updates, what should we be looking for?
Yeah, some of it is already happening. So individual countries have cut deals with Iran for free passage of their flagged ships to go through, or ships that are carrying fuel to their countries that are flagged on other countries. And so, that reportedly is allowing a few to squeak through, including in the last 24 hours. India also reportedly had cut a deal with the Iranians. So if you see more and more countries cut their own sort of separate piece and their individual deals to let their ships through, I mean, the Iranians are the ones blocking it, so they could choose to hit or go after this ship but not that ship, and so forth. And that may take some of the pressure off of global fuel prices, but probably not a huge amount of pressure off if you sort of let them out in onesies and twosies and things like that. So that's one. There's sort of a race now to be able to destroy the capabilities that Iran has to be able to hold ships at risk in the Strait of Hormuz. So it's, the problems are fast boats, these little basically motor boats, and somebody can go up to a gigantic tanker and put a limpet mine stuck to the side of it and blow a hole in the tanker. And then, all you have to do is imagine that, and you don't want to be driving that tanker through the strait. Well, they got a lot of fast boats. So now they're attacking sites where these fast boats are. They have missile batteries on the coastal batteries on the Strait of Hormuz that fire missiles. Those were attacked yesterday with some big bunker busters, some deeply buried ones. They're going to attack other things. And then probably the hardest thing is these drones, which can fly from 1,000 miles away from almost anywhere. And you could, have it smack into one of these ships. So those are if you see like the degradation of those capabilities on the Iranian side, then that's a signal that Iran might not be able to do this forever. If you see a bigger international coalition that's actually willing to move, to actually do stuff, as opposed to saying, well, when all this is over, then we'll do stuff, then that is a signal that you could look for. And then the final one, I mean, the sort of the two dramatic options here, like I think I said earlier, there's a Marine Expeditionary Unit of 2,200 Marines that is coming from the Indo-Pacific to to the Middle East. That will be there probably in a week and a half or two or something like that. There's some thought that if you can't secure the strait by then you have them